Griffin, I think you want to.
Chair, before we begin this afternoon's evidence, there's an important matter to be addressed in relation to the evidence the inquiry was due to hear this Wednesday, the 14th of May. That evidence relates to the use of Oxyvision technology on wards and units operated by EPIRT, as well as to the technology more generally, and concerns that have been raised about its use. The inquiry was due to hear from three witnesses: Hat Porter, on behalf of the campaign group Stop Oxyvision; Laura Cousins, Head of Patient Safety and Quality at OxyHealth Limited; and Zephan Trent, Executive Director of Strategy, Transformation and Digital, and Senior Information Risk Officer at EPIRT. The inquiry had sent to the Trust on the 14th of March 2025 a request under Rule 9 for a witness statement in relation to various aspects of the Trust's use of Oxyvision technology. That was Rule 9.3c. The Trust's response was a witness statement from Mr. Trent, dated the 21st of March 2025. That statement was disclosed to all core participants on the 28th of March as part of the inquiry's core bundle of statements for these hearings, and it can be found at pages 1285 to 1313 of that bundle. A number of relevant exhibits were also disclosed to core participants. On the 26th of March, the Trust was notified that Zephan Trent would be required to attend to give oral evidence during the course of this week. In the witness statement, paragraph 42, brief reference was made to a review that was then being undertaken, and I quote, to ensure that the Trust has considered the matters raised in the NHS England document that was published in 2025, Principles for Using Digital Technologies in Mental Health Inpatient Treatment and Care. That document has also been disclosed to core participants and can be found at pages 13660 to 13671 of the exhibits bundle. While the statement indicated that the inquiry would be updated about the outcome of the Trust's review, no further information was given. On Wednesday the 6th of May, after working hours, the inquiry's legal team received an email from the Trust's representatives informing us that the Trust would be serving an additional witness statement from Mr. Trent that would provide details of actions taken since the review that he'd referred to in his original witness statement. The additional witness statement was not received until mid-morning last Friday, the 9th of May, leaving less than 3 working days for the inquiry's legal team to review, process, and disclose it to core participants, and still less time for core participants and their legal representatives to review, consider, and formulate questions on it under Rule 10 of the inquiry rules, and I'll come back to that. Even a preliminary analysis of the additional statement, which was accompanied by 8 exhibits running to over 100 pages, revealed that far from a review that simply considered the matters raised in the NHS England document I've referred to, the Trust appears to have been in the process of effecting very substantial changes, both operationally and in terms of policy and approach to the use of Oxyvision technology. The position appears to be a very different one than was set out in the Trust's initial statement just 6 weeks earlier, and that is not just in relation to the question of consent. While the inquiry's legal team did communicate to both the witnesses and legal representatives for OxyHealth Limited and Stop Oxyvision in meetings on the morning of last Friday that a new statement from the Trust was to be received, that was of little assistance to those witnesses and their legal teams until the statement was actually received and could be disclosed to them, which was done later in the day. The new witness statement tells us that the changes set out in relation to the Trust's use of Oxyvision were only authorised at board level last Wednesday, on the 7th of May. The exhibits to the new witness statement demonstrate that by the 10th of April, it was clear within EPUT that major policy and procedural change was needed and would occur. Equally, those exhibits make clear that during the month of April, in relation to those major changes, new training plans were being written, new staff and inpatient briefings were being drafted, new information posters were being prepared, and that a new standard operating procedure was to be finalised before the end of April. The situation is, to say the least, highly unsatisfactory. Whilst that will be a matter for careful examination at a later stage, it's nonetheless difficult to see why, during the month of April, not only were the Trust's very significant changes to its policies and operating procedures plainly afoot, but substantial preparatory and implementation work for those changes had begun, the inquiry was not afforded any indication of them. Chair, having considered the matter with great care, you have decided that in fairness to all core participants, as well as those engaging with the inquiry, including those to whom the use of Oxyvision technology is of importance and concern, it would no longer be appropriate to hear evidence relating to Oxyvision this Wednesday, the 14th, and that the evidence of all three witnesses from whom the inquiry had planned to hear will be moved to a later hearing. That decision has not been taken lightly, and in taking it, you have borne in mind the fact that witnesses, in particular for Stop Oxyvision and OxyHealth Limited, were prepared and ready to give their evidence in just 2 days' time, and that the postponement of this evidence inevitably causes significant disruption and potentially causes distress. The fact that Hat Porter, the witness for Stop Oxyvision, wishes to proceed with their evidence this Wednesday, despite the material changes to the Trust's positions. Chair, you've considered with care submissions provided to you about this. However, in line with your duty under Section 17(3) of the Inquiries Act 2005 to act with fairness, you've carefully considered, amongst other things, the extremely late disclosure of these matters and the very limited time therefore afforded to core participants, legal representatives and the inquiry to review and consider them. In your view, the time is unacceptably short, particularly given the importance and potential impact of the changes revealed by the information in the new witness statement and exhibits, which may give rise to additional questions of fundamental importance, both to the inquiry and to core participants, as well as to Stop Oxyvision. May I just expand on that, please? Chair, in your view, there is insufficient time for the process that would need to follow the receipt of this new evidence, consideration by core participants with their clients, formulation of further questions under the Rule 10 procedure to provide to the Council to the inquiry team, and for the CTI team then to review them and incorporate them as appropriate in questions for the witness or witnesses on Wednesday. Furthermore, the new information is likely, for example, to lead to a further request for evidence from EPUT, for example, about the extent to which the changed approach and the reasons for it are a commentary on the processes previously adopted, including during the period within this inquiry's scope. Chair, you will also recall that the Trust, in its opening in September last year, expressed a commitment to candid engagement with this inquiry, approaching the inquiry in an open, collaborative and supportive way, assisting the inquiry in its investigations, responding to all requests as fully as it can, doing all that it can to ensure that full and frank evidence is given by its staff, supporting you and your team to give to families, carers, and those with lived experience the answers they have been waiting for. The Trust must now seek to honour those commitments through its actions, not through words or further broad assurances. It will be held to those commitments by this inquiry, by all those who suffered, and by and in full view of the wider public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffin. I want to add that I have considered all the written submissions made to me on this matter with great care, and I've also considered the wider circumstances. I'm profoundly conscious that some call participants may be disappointed with the decision I've made to postpone hearing evidence in relation to Oxyvision. I wish to reassure call participants to this inquiry and the public that the use of Oxyvision is and will remain a matter of significant interest for the inquiry. My decision to postpone evidence into this area should not be viewed in any way as enabling EPUT to avoid answering questions about its use of Oxyvision or to evade responsibility. Quite the reverse. I wish to make it clear that I am extremely dissatisfied with EPUT's late submission of evidence. I have said previously, and I repeat, that I will not hesitate to use my statutory powers to compel evidence should this be required. Thank you, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to my colleague, Ms. Harris, and this afternoon's witness.
Thank you, Ms. Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Well, we now move to a slightly different area of evidence, and that is evidence that is going to provide an overview of how mental health services were being provided by EPUT during the relevant period and to some extent now. And we will begin by looking at a topic of pre-admission assessments. And so that having been said, I think we've got ready and waiting Dr. Corrali, and who will, I think, be sworn to start off with. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I, Dr. Milind Karale, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Please, can you state your full name for the record?
It's Milind Ramkrishna Karale.
Dr. Corrali, you are the Executive Medical Director at Essex Partnership University NHS Foundation Trust, that we also know as EPUT.
That's correct. Can I, Chair, before I give my evidence, I would like to offer my personal condolences to the families for their loss and apology for the poor quality of care they've received. Thank you.
Going back to your position then, Dr. Corrali, you have held that position within the Trust and its predecessor, SEPT, since 2012.
That's correct.
Your portfolio includes medical leadership, managing medical directorate, Caldicott guardian responsibilities, and research.
That's right.
You are also what is known as the responsible officer for the purposes of revalidation of doctors. In short, you ensure that doctors working within the Trust are fit to practice from EPUT's perspective.
That's correct.
And you provide information to the General Medical Council if required.
That's correct.
You report directly to Paul Scott, EPUT's Chief Executive Officer.
That's correct.
You are also a consultant psychiatrist.
That's correct.
By way of background, as part of its work, and you'll be familiar with this, the inquiry sent a Rule 9 request to EPUT for evidence about pre-admission mental health assessments. And when EPUT received that request for evidence, it was you that made a witness statement to the inquiry on behalf of EPUT to provide the information.
That's correct.
For anyone following by way of documentation, that statement begins at page 1032 of the core bundle, which was disclosed for the purposes of this hearing, and that statement will be published in due course. Do you have a copy of that witness statement in front of you?
I do. Chair, I'd also like to say that I have relied on other colleagues for gathering this information, and I may not have in-depth knowledge of all aspects of the evidence that's been provided.
And you can point that out to
Thank you.
Ms. Harris
I was
as we go on.
thank you, Chair. And if for some reason I haven't made that clear or it's not clear, please do make clear when you have relied on the information of others. Your statement, I think, is 64 pages long. It's dated the 25th of March this year, and at page 60 of that statement, or page 1091 of the core bundle, you make a statement of truth and you've signed it.
That's correct.
I understand that there are 2 minor corrections you'd like to make to the statement, and I'll ask you to identify those when we get to the relevant part.
Yeah.
They both, in fact, relate to your evidence about mixed sex wards.
That's correct.
Do you ask that this statement be taken as your evidence to the inquiry at this stage?
Yes.
Let me make this clear. Although I'm going to ask you questions about it, I'm not going to take you through it line by line, and we may jump around. And we will pick up on issues and matters of interest and concern to the participants. But your statement and the exhibits with it, and there were 42, is that right?
That's correct.
Will all form part of the evidence for this inquiry to be considered by the chair in due course. So in short, I am acknowledging that you have covered in your statement more than we will necessarily deal with in oral evidence. Also, by way of background, are you aware that last Thursday the inquiry heard evidence from 2 experts, a consultant psychiatrist and a senior nurse?
Yes, I'm aware.
Excuse me. They gave evidence at high level of what constitutes good care for mental health inpatients, and they gave evidence of the key principles and standards for the delivery of that care. But the request made to EPUT was a different one. And can you confirm it was a request for a broad explanation of the forms of mental health assessment that EPUT's patients received over the relevant period?
That's right.
And it was a request for an understanding of the guidance, policies and other documents that applied to those assessments.
That's right.
Your evidence this afternoon will therefore focus on pre-admission assessments undertaken by EPUT during the relevant period, the arrangements in place and where you've provided it, the relevant documentation. Can I ask you, or begin by asking you, a preliminary question about your statement? And this is a general, to step back please and just consider your statement in its form. Would you agree that at some points your statement might be considered or read as aspirational? Do you know what I mean by that?
I understand what you're saying. It'd be helpful if, while going through the statement, if there are certain areas you feel are aspirational, I'm happy to comment on those.
Perhaps I should make it more clear. Please forgive me. I mean certain areas, and we'll look at them, where you set out what processes should be. Apologies. Thank you, Chair. Sometimes setting out what processes should be and what should happen as opposed to what might have actually happened. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes,
All
yes.
right. At paragraph 10 of your statement, you start your evidence in effect with the following 2 statements. The first, that an assessment of a patient is a dynamic process and occurs at every contact with a healthcare professional, including planned, unplanned, formal or informal contact. Do you see that?
That's correct, yeah.
And also that mental health assessments are therefore a skilled and often very complex process.
That's my opinion.
So do we take that, as you've answered my next question, that in your view and experience, some form of assessment takes place whenever a healthcare professional engages with a patient?
That's correct. We heard from Dr. Davidson as well last week that every interaction is some form of assessment, may not be a formal assessment, but a clinician who sees a patient undertakes some form of assessment.
And those assessments can be complex.
That's true.
You also state that it involves identifying social and psychological factors contributing or leading to the presentation as the professional tries to understand how each of these elements influences the person's mental well-being. And these factors would include, for example, neurodevelopmental conditions such as autism, for example.
That's correct.
For the record, from paragraph 10 to paragraph 14 of your statement, you go on to set further issues or set out further issues to be taken into account when undertaking an assessment of an individual's mental health, And you acknowledge in your paragraph 14, do you agree, that the process of an assessment becomes more formal at the point of a referral being made to a service?
That's correct.
The purpose of your first witness statement, as we've outlined to this inquiry, was to provide an overview of how assessments were undertaken in practice at EPUT, and to some extent the position now. Can we begin, please, by putting up paragraph 15 of Dr. Corrali's statement? You can have a look at it. It's at page 1036 of the core bundle. There you say, paragraph 15, assessment documents are used to seek and document the clinical understanding of a patient's presenting problem, clinical history and triggers, family history, personal history, past psychiatric, medical history, substance misuse history, medication, social situation, forensic history, mental state examination, and risk assessment. As part of the assessment process, the clinician will consider the patient's mental capacity to make informed decisions of the outcome and pathways to follow the assessment. To inform the assessment, additional tools may be used which are dependent upon the patient's presenting concerns and needs. These are utilised in addition to the Trust's requirement of a risk assessment document approved for use within the Trust's record systems. Regarding risk assessment, a comprehensive history eliciting various risk and mitigating factors, along with a detailed mental state examination, is key in understanding the risks and formulating a risk management plan. Can I ask you some questions about that paragraph, please?
Please.
Which sets out in one go the position. When you say or refer to assessment documents at the beginning, what are you talking about there?
So in order to undertake these, to gather the information in a structured manner, Trust has certain forms to undertake core assessments. So we have two major record systems, the Mobius and Paris, and the two core psychiatric assessment forms, 2.1 on Mobius and V6 on Paris, capture all the headings which you read out just now, so that the information is gathered in a structured manner.
When you refer to additional tools, what are you referring to?
So this is the core psychiatric assessment to understand patients' psychiatric presentation. There are additional tools which are used by certain specialties. For example, in old age services, in order to decide where a patient gets admitted, frailty is an important component. And to understand the level of frailty, a frailty tool might be used. So there are other tools which add to the core assessment, but the core assessment is the main psychiatric assessment that's undertaken.
In relation to your reference to risk assessment documents, can you explain what those are, please?
So my personal view is a comprehensive psychiatric assessment is a risk assessment. There are brief risk assessment tools, but in EPUT, what we have done on the two main assessment forms is we've included the risk assessment at the bottom of the assessment form, so they are not separate. We expect the clinicians to undertake a comprehensive assessment and then provide a formulation at the end. If I can, because it is risk assessment, as we heard last week, can't be a form-filling exercise. I'm happy to illustrate that with an example.
Perhaps we'll come back to that, but it may be that you can help us with this. Why are there specific documents that are required then for use within the Trust's record systems?
So longitudinally, the forms have also evolved as I have shown in my statement. Currently, the risk assessment is part of the comprehensive assessment. There are other brief risk assessment tools which are undertaken when someone is leaving the ward, where on a leave, because the assessment's already been undertaken, and that assessment of risk is for a specific purpose. There are other risks could be, it's a huge term. In forensic services, if they are assessing a risk of arson, there would be specific risk assessment tools for assessing the risk of arson. Likewise, there would be specific risk assessments tools for assessing the risk of aggression and violence. I've mentioned HCR 20. So there are various risk assessment tools for various purposes. But when we talk about a core psychiatric assessment leading to an understanding of a person's risk in context of the mental illness, we rely on that initial assessment form.
So again, to be clear, is there a specific then risk assessment document formulated by the Trust which is approved for use within your system?
There is. It is, and it covers broad headings: risk to self, risk of self-harm, risk of suicide, risk of aggression and violence, risk of neglect. So there are various headings. What we have done is we've not made it a tick box exercise. These are areas, indicators of which areas a person needs to be mindful of, depending on the presentation. Risk assessment forms, as we heard last week, can never be tick box exercises. They are just a way of guiding a clinician as to what areas they need to cover when in gathering information.
And is an audit carried out then? I'm not asking for any results or outcomes, but does the Trust then audit the use of this risk assessment document?
Risk assessment documents are audited.
We'll
However, can I add, as we heard last week, that it is the quality of the assessment that's important rather than risk assessment forms. And as Dr. Davidson mentioned, health services have been far preoccupied with the risk assessment tools. We try to make it more as an area where an assessment can be documented. For example, if a person is seen following an overdose, it is important to understand. It's understanding the person and the circumstances. How long has the person been contemplating about it? What led to? Did the person took an overdose inside the house or drove 5 miles away into the bush to take an overdose? Did he seek help afterwards? Did he make any final acts? This is a conversation. You cannot get that information by filling a form. How does the person feel now? Is he relieved that someone has listened and help is available, or the person still feels actively suicidal? So that forms a risk assessment.
We'll come back a little bit to risk assessment and assessment in due course, but just dealing with this paragraph further, there's reference within it to mental capacity, and assessment of mental capacity is vital because it dictates the path a patient's treatment might take.
It is more relevant in certain specialities. As we know, capacity is taken as person is taken to have capacity, and it's capacity specific. But in elderly care services where dementia, where capacity is an issue, this becomes more relevant.
And do you agree then, using that perhaps as the last example, as an example, that the involvement in family and carers at that point in the assessment of mental capacity is of fundamental importance if that information is available?
Absolutely. Family involvement is essential in wherever possible in every assessment.
Put shortly, how is capacity assessed?
So capacity is topic specific, it's matter specific, and should be undertaken by a person who is either undertaking that procedure or assessment. So whether the person understands the question, that is he able to weigh the pros and cons of that particular decision, whether to stay on the ward or not get admitted or not get admitted, whether he can retain the information that's provided, and he can convey that information. So there are several steps, formal steps that are undertaken. But capacity, it is assumed that person has a capacity. One should never assume that person lacks capacity unless there are indicators, and then you need to undertake a formal assessment.
It's obviously a very difficult area. How important are consultant leadership, for example, or peer review, talking to colleagues in assessing a patient's capacity?
As I mentioned, capacity is for a specific condition, treatment, purpose. if the capacity is for a procedure, the person who is undertaking that procedure, who knows that procedure, is best placed to explain that procedure and see whether the person understands that procedure. And again, the steps where the weigh the pros and cons of not agreeing to that procedure. So the person who is undertaking a capacity for a specific purpose needs to have a knowledge of the particular task or the point in the matter in question.
Is that person encouraged, or are professionals encouraged to discuss those sorts of matters with colleagues?
Certainly, yes.
We'll return to the question of documents and record keeping in a while, but in relation to pre-admission assessments and undertaking those assessments, or EPUT undertaking those assessments over the relevant period, you explain in your statement that the requirements for an assessment have evolved, I think is the word you would use. You explain that there have been changes that are apparent from the policies that you've provided, and we'll look at one of two of them in a moment, and you have set those changes out in your statement. You do note, however, for the record at your paragraph 17, that a generic assessment, you say, undertaken by psychiatrists has followed the same structure for a number of years as guided by the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
That's correct.
Can we consider then the policy and procedure that you refer to in your statement, that you indicate was governing and guiding EPUT's delivery of mental health care, including pre-admission assessment, which is what we're dealing with this afternoon, over the relevant period? And I think you would agree that your statement focuses very closely on the care programme approach.
That was the national document guiding the assessments and the care planning.
I think it's also known in shorthand as the CPA, is that right? So we can perhaps call it the CPA. And Dr. Davidson gave evidence about the CPA last week, you'll be aware, and it's also set out in broad terms in many of the documents you've provided. But can we have a look, please, at what you say about it? And can we put up paragraph 45 of Dr. Crowley's statement, which is at 1050? And just to set the scene, although most will know about it, the care programme approach, the CPA, was introduced by the Department of Health in 1991 to provide a framework for effective mental health care. As an overview, it provides a process which describes the approach used in mental health services to assess, develop a personalised care plan, manage risk, review and coordinate care and support in order to address the needs of people requiring the expertise of secondary mental health services. So pausing for a moment, and hopefully I don't summarise this inaccurately, but if the inquiry understands your witness statement and what you've just said and the documents you've provided, the CPA was, or is, we'll come back to that in a moment, the approach taken by EPUT throughout an individual's contact and engagement with mental health services, and by that I mean right from first contact, referral or assessment, through any care provided in the community, to the services provided to an individual as an inpatient, through to discharge and beyond. That approach applies throughout.
That's right.
And the inquiry understands from the evidence that there are criteria to be met before care is provided to a patient in accordance with the CPA.
That's correct.
And we'll come to that in a moment. I think the slide can go down now. Thank you, Amanda. That there are two levels of CPA, standard and enhanced.
There used to be two levels of CPA. CPA underwent a change. They realized that standard and enhanced created a two-tier system. What it meant was that patients who were on enhanced CPA had a care coordinator. They had defined which patients were eligible for enhanced CPA, who had more complex presentations, more than one agency requiring input, and so forth. And standard CPAs where only one agency was involved. Most of the patients in the outpatient clinics were standard CPAs, but CPAs moved away from either you're on a CPA or not on a CPA.
When did that happen?
This happened, exactly don't remember, I think it's 2026, around that time.
2016.
2016.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. There were, and we'll go back because obviously this inquiry is concerned with how care was being provided over the relevant period, so back to 2000. But there are four main elements to the CPA, which are, I think, as follows: systematic arrangements for assessing the health and social care needs of people accepted into specialist mental health services. And then secondly, the formation of a care plan, and a care plan, we heard in evidence, should follow the patient. The appointment of a care coordinator, that is key, I think. We'll come back to that in a moment. And regular review, and where necessary, agreed changes to the care plan. Those were the four principles. Now, dealing with the relevant period, it would appear, and we'll look at it in a moment, from the evidence that you provided, that EPUT and its predecessor trusts, I'm going to call them SEPT and NET, if that's all right, have provided mental health care and services in accordance with the CPA throughout the relevant period, the period that this inquiry is concerned with. Is that right? 2000 to 2023.
Yes, as per the evidence, I have not had any involvement in NEP, so I'm relying on documents, but SEPT, I've seen CPA being implemented since I've been in SEPT and EPUT.
That's why I think that's why I explained it's from part of it. That is from the documents that you've provided. We'll look at them in a moment. And the CPA applies to all adults of working age in contact with mental health services.
That's patient may have a very brief interaction with the mental health services and may not be on a CPA. It doesn't, in my understanding, it doesn't apply to everyone. Patients, when they come into mental health services and they are with the community mental health team or have an inpatient, they then go on a CPA. A brief assessment does not mean that a patient will be on a CPA. Patients could be referred for example, neurodiversity assessments. They have their assessment and they get a diagnosis or not, and they're discharged. That patient would not go on a CPA. So there are certain...
Perhaps it was my question. Should I have said all adults who met the criteria?
Yes.
Although I think it's right to say that its principles throughout the period have applied to younger people and older adults as well.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Let's just look then, please, at what was provided, or the approach that was provided. Can we start with SEPT? And again, I'm not going to take you through all of this documentation. We'd be here for a long time if I did. But you set out that SEPT's the first version you can locate of the CPA handbook is dated July 2003. So that's not the beginning, but early on in the period with which the inquiry is concerned. Please can we put up MK2, which is at page 7,300, I believe. I think that's just the top of it. I'm not sure if we can zoom out a little bit. Or if not, we can just look at both. I think if we can probably see that. So that's the very first version that you have located. I think that if people can see that. It's dated July 2003. This is a handbook. I don't know if people can make it out, but we see reference on the bottom of the page that the document has been produced by the CPA steering group. Do you see that, Dr.
Yep.
Corrali? Who are they, please, or what are they, or what is that? The CPA steering group.
I'll have to get back to you on that. This was way before my time.
Is there a CPA steering group in existence now, or was there in the latter period?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. I think we can move very briefly through the slides. If we look at 7,301 on the left-hand side, I think we can see it actually. It's the page underneath. So I think that's the background. And I think if we look down to the next page, 7302. Not sure if it's possible. Thank you. We see, and I'm not going to go through it in detail, but we see the purpose of the handbook is on the left-hand side, and we see there, this is back in 2003, the criteria then for acceptance onto the CPA. If we look down to 7304, please. Again, I appreciate this is early on in the period. This is in 2003. We see assessment is dealt with at the left-hand side of the page, which you replicate at your paragraph 19, which the purpose of the undertaking an initial assessment or screening of a service use to circumstances is to determine whether intervention from the mental health services is considered appropriate, where the criteria for the CPA approach is met. A full holistic health and social care assessment must be undertaken to determine the following: areas of need, difficulties including levels of risk, strengths and abilities of the service user, identify the service user's CPA level of need, and of course this was when they were standard or enhanced, and identify the need for specialist assessments. And then it goes on to deal with how the assessment process must be thorough and comprehensive. And that the practitioner undertaking the assessment must assure that the service user and carer, where appropriate, was central to the process. So right from the beginning of the period, we can see documents acknowledging the importance of families and carers and their input. We see on the right-hand side risk assessment and the management of risk. Again, I'm not going to read this all out, but we can see that it says risk assessment is an essential and ongoing part of the CPA process. Risk must be clearly documented and reviewed regularly. Risk management is regarded as an ongoing process. And there it lists examples of risk: self-harm, suicide, violence to others, and other types of risk are listed. Self-neglect, exploitation are all outlined there. On page 7305, I think, if we look at that briefly, please. There is reference there, thank you, to the risk profile tool, which was to be completed in the following circumstances for those clients who meet the criteria for enhanced CPA status. And we see on admission to hospital and or prior to discharge, at the practitioner's discretion, if in doubt, complete the risk profile, and the completion of the risk profile tool will supplement the CPA contingency plan. Now, I'm not going to suggest we go through the handbook in detail, but it goes on to describe, I think, the processes and requirements for those admitted as inpatients through to discharge. And whilst we're dealing in this evidence session with pre-admission assessments, we know, as we've already identified, that the CPA approach would apply for the whole of the inpatient pathway. So that was back in 2003, and that was the handbook. The corresponding CPA policy is your exhibit MK16, which we have, if I'm right, please, at page 7571. Can I just ask you a question? This is the policy, this CPA policy. We see at the top CLP 30. We'll get used to that reference from 2003. Can I just ask you about paragraph 1.3, which says that the CPA forms, guidance and audit tools introduced with this policy and procedure provide a more consistent framework for the delivery and monitoring of the CPA approach. But it's important to emphasise that CPA is a framework for good practice and a way of working, not just a new set of documents and forms. The ability of individual practitioners to communicate clearly with each other, work in partnership with service users and carers, and use sound professional judgment and skills are crucial to its success. Now, appreciating that you weren't working in SEPT in 2003, are you able to tell us what the forms and guided and audit forms consisted of back in 2003?
I'll have to get back to you on this one.
It's not, I think, any of the documentation that you've been able to provide. Your statement, I think if we can take that down, please, thank you, Amanda. Your statement follows the development then of the CPA from EPUT's perspective through that period. So you've provided SEP documents from 2006. And again, I'm not going to take us through all of them, but please can we put up the SEP CPA policy dated September 2006, which is your MK4, which is 7327, please. Sorry, I won't. Thank you very much. Again, I just want to ask you about one or two aspects of this document. We can see it's an updated CLP30, and it sets out at the beginning a controls assurance statement, and an introduction sets out that it applies to all service users with a mental illness or who are in a mental health crisis in contact with secondary mental health services, both health and social care, and that it's not dependent on the setting in which care is provided, and it's just as relevant to people with mental health problems in prisons, in residential care, supported housing, nursing homes, secure units, or in hospitals as it is to those living independently. So it's very broadly applied. And it says at 1.2, the Trust will provide a set of standardised CPA processes and, where necessary, accompanying documentation which will be used by adult mental health services. In order to ensure consistency, best practice and continuity, this documentation will be approved and managed by the CPA steering group. But that's not a group with which you're familiar, you can tell us. And then looking at 1.3, please, it says services such as older people, children, forensic, drug and alcohol, learning disabilities and inpatients will require service appropriate assessment, care planning and review documentation. All documentation will be approved centrally by the CPA steering group in order to ensure compatibility. Are you aware in this period of any of that separate documentation that applies to those different groups or specialist assessments?
I'm not aware, but I can understand the reason why they would want to have specialist CPA forms for different services.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but in terms of that documentation, that's, as I say, not something that you've been able to provide, and again, you're not sure what the CPA steering group was. Can I just ask that we look at one or two features of the assessment section, which is at 7328. And in fact, can we look at paragraph 3.1, which is also set out in your paragraph 21, and it's been suggested, actually because it's small, can we expand paragraph 3.1, Amanda? It might help with viewing, please. Meanwhile, I'll I think read it in any event.
Yeah, that's fine, I can see it.
Thank you very much. All persons assessed by the Clinical Assessment Service, I'll come back to that in a moment, will receive a core assessment which will include mental health, physical health, medication, substance misuse, learning disabilities, forensic history, cultural and spiritual needs, relationships, carers' needs, housing, finance, employment, education, and networks. All persons referred for a medical opinion or psychology services will be assessed in accordance with their specialist practice. It is expected that all assessments will adhere to the principles of social inclusion. Thank you. And can we move on to 3.4, which is further down the page, please? Just underlines that risk assessment is integrated into the assessment processes at all stages. Therefore, where risks are identified, the management of those risks will be addressed in the care plan, whether at that time, whether it was standard or enhanced.
Yep.
This was CLP 30 was to read in conjunction with the corresponding policy regarding clinical risk assessment and management. And again, can we just look briefly, please, at your MK3, which is page 7319. I just want to there it is, to identify it as 2006. This is the clinical procedural guidelines, and it indicates in the bottom of the first paragraph that these guidelines should be read in conjunction with associated trust policies, serious untoward incidents, accident and incident reporting care program approach, which is what we've just looked at, and at 1.1 that they identify the principles of managing risk. But can we have a look, please, over the page at paragraph 4.4 on 7320? Risk assessment and the management of risk is a fundamental principle within the care programme approach, see policy CLP 30. This includes management of handing over and discontinuation of care between professionals. Can I just ask you very briefly about that? We heard some evidence about it from Dr. Davidson last week. That's an area of particular difficulty, isn't it, when you're transferring care? That's when information gets lost.
And that's one of the reasons why, if you look at the CPA document, it stipulates where a CPA review needs to take place. It's, as a rule, every 6 months. But if a patient is being transferred from one service to another, or being discharged from inpatient unit into the community, or moving out of area, so there were certain transition points where it was identified that the risks of either a relapse or a discontinuation are higher, that a CPA review and a risk assessment as part of the CPA review should be undertaken. I think that was the purpose of that particular statement.
Again, I won't read them out, but if we look at 7321, we see the section in relation to assessing risk and the elements of risk that are listed. Again, I won't read them out at 5.1 and 5.2. I think that can come down, please, Amanda. Thank you. Can I just ask you very briefly about those being treated in the relevant period for whom care was providing under the CPA, as opposed to those who were considered non-CPA? We've already heard and noted that there were criteria to be met for a patient to be treated under the CPA, but there would have been many for patients who didn't meet that criteria. And I think you have identified a SEPT handbook from 2009, or two, one from May and one from September 2009, that deals with that. And it's right, I think, that I should say, could we look at page 7356, Amanda? Maybe that. This is your MK7. And I just want to look at 1.2.2. I think it's my fault. I've given the reference 7360 as a later reference, but it's 73.
Is that it?
It isn't, but I can perhaps just read the relevant sentence. We'll come on to that in a moment. But that's non-CPA applies to service users with a mental illness or who are in a mental health crisis but do not have the higher risks and complex clinical symptoms or care management requiring multi-agency intervention with care coordination.
And that was a distinction between an enhanced and a simple and a standard CPA.
I think we can turn, to NEPT, please. And we note from paragraph 26 of your witness statement that NEPT had similar provisions, and you provided the inquiry with a copy of a NEPT CPA policy dated March 2007. And could we put up a copy of that policy? It's your MK8. And it starts at R7365. Thank you. As we understand your evidence, that's the earliest document that it was possible to retrieve from NEPT, is that right?
Yeah.
Its approval date was March 2007 with a review date of 2008. But just in terms of what was going on at NEPT in the relevant period, if we look at page 3732, please. 37372, sorry. And could we look at paragraphs 8.1 and 8.2? In relation to assessment,
Yep.
it says that all mental health service users will receive a comprehensive, holistic assessment of their mental health and social care needs. This should be carried out by a professionally qualified member of the mental health team and must always include an assessment of risk, and that the agreed trust-wide multi-CPA assessment and CPA assessment guidelines should be used. I'm asked to clarify this because this is replicated at paragraph 27 of your statements. When it says all mental health service users will receive a comprehensive holistic assessment of their mental health and social care needs, that means they will undergo an assessment, not that they will receive a document or anything of that nature.
Yeah. I think the core element of CPA was that if a patient requires an assessment, an assessment should be offered, and there was a process of referral screening or initial screening to see whether the patient met the criteria. Things were slightly different at the time when services were defined as mental health services are providing services for patients with severe and enduring mental illnesses. So there were certain criteria. Primary care has tried 2 antidepressants for a duration of time before. So the initial screening was undertaken to see whether the person met the requirements for an assessment, and based on that assessment, that the patient qualified for subsequent treatment.
If we look in terms of what NEPT were doing in the relevant period, can we just look at the top of the next page, please? 7373, 8.4 and 8.5. It says assessments must identify service users' strengths, skills and abilities, and must identify what is required to promote recovery. The assessment should take into account service users' own beliefs and opinions about their mental health issues. And it then goes on to say assessments of need should identify all aspects where specific support and further assessments are required, and then gives a list there of the aspects that should be considered. And at 8.6, there is an example of the types of specialist assessments that may be required. Is that right? Can I just ask that we go to 7374, please, which is the assessment, the section on risk assessment. And it says, please refer to the Trust's clinical risk management protocol. Do you see that? And it says risk assessment is an essential and ongoing part of the CPA process, and there must be a specific assessment of the level of risk posed to self and or others using the Trust's approved risk assessment tool. Risk assessment should take into account all of the available information from the service user and other sources, such as GP, carers, family members, other professionals and agencies who have knowledge of the individual. And again, it lists at 9.4 that risk assessment should include an estimation of the degree of risk presented in respect of, and gives a list of indicators or things that should be considered. Can I ask this, has it not been possible to identify or locate the Trust's clinical risk management protocol from that time?
I've relied on people to gather information. I can take it back and see whether they can locate the required protocol.
Just finishing the chronology, that was reviewed in April 2009. I'm not going to ask us to look at it. That can come down. Thank you, Amanda. And you set out the additions at the paragraph 28 of your statement. It was reviewed again in July 2012, and you set out the additions at paragraph 29 of your statement. So that's what SEPT and NEPT were doing. And EPUT, we know, was formed in 2017. And at your paragraph 30, you explain how the CPA policy documents from SEPT and NEPT, you say, were reviewed and harmonised. Can we look, please, quickly at MK11 at page... Oh, sorry. From that MK11, page 7488 or 196, I think, Amanda, internally. And if we see the top of that document, we can see that which you've described. I'm looking at the top right hand of the table. The care programme approach, policy and procedure has been harmonised and reviewed following the merger of SEPT and NEPT to ensure it's fit for purpose for the new organisation. Can we please now look at 7491? And we note there the introduction about the care programme approach, and at 1.2 that it's what the framework and what it's intended to do. And do we notice at 1.3 that the patient carer is put at the centre of care planning and delivery? That was the point.
Yes, that's right.
We see, this is EPUT's first document following the merger, that 2.1, it explains how, following the initial assessment, service users will be placed on either CPA or non-CPA, and that's a clinical decision.
That's right.
And it sets out the differences there between CPA and non-CPA, which we've touched on. Can we go over the page, please, to 7492 and confirm at 2.2 that CPA or non-CPA is applicable to all individuals, adults, older adults and younger people receiving secondary mental health services in whatever setting that care is delivered. And that at 2.3 the following key groups will automatically be considered to require the support of CPA, and the top bullet point is of those who are admitted to a mental health hospital as an inpatient.
That's correct.
What's the date of this again?
Pardon?
What's the date of this again? Sorry.
This is the 2017. This is the first EPUT CPA policy after the merger, Chair. If we look at the bottom of the page, 7492, CPA process deals with the referrals and acknowledges, and we'll come to this in a moment, that they're received from a range of sources and all sorts of sources are listed there. And it sets out the components of 3.2, and for the purposes of this afternoon, we can see that it applies to assessing and risk assessing. Over the page at 7493, we see some of the language now being merged from the previous policies we've looked at, SEPT and NEPT, as you've said, and 3.3 at the top. Those accepted for assessment will receive a comprehensive holistic assessment of their mental and physical health and social care needs in line with the Care Act, and this must always include an assessment of risk. And at 3.4, risk assessment is an essential and ongoing part of the CPA process, and there must be specific assessment of the level of risk posed to self and or others using the Trust's approved risk assessment tool. In the corresponding procedure, which is your MK12, which is at page 7498. Sorry, it starts at 7495, but could we look please at 7498? Perhaps important to note at the bottom, 7498. What is an assessment? The assessment is the starting point of all patient care. And no doubt you share that sentiment.
That's right.
Very important aspect. And 7500, please. Is there a table which you set out in your statement?
Yep.
There we go. Of everything that should be taken into account as part of the assessment. Again, I won't go through that. So again, understanding the position correctly, the CPA carried on applying to all mental health assessments in the relevant period after the merger of EPUT. And you complete the picture, and then I promise we will leave the documents alone for a while, by providing MK13, which I think is the most recent EPUT CPA policy and procedure. That's page 7517, please. And we see that's the CPA policy, EPUT CPA policy. If we look at the policy summary, it says it outlines the implementation of the CARE programme approach and non-CPA for Essex Partnership University Foundation Trust. It must be applied together with other relevant legislation and should be read in conjunction with CPA procedure, which provides detailed reference for staff and advice regarding care under CPA and non-CPA. Goes on to explain again what the CPA is. But do we see that this document is next due for review in March 2026?
That's right.
So this is still of application?
Still of application.
That's the policy, and if we look very briefly at page 7524, do we see the corresponding, the corresponding procedure, which again has a review date at this time of May 2026.
That's correct, yeah.
So that's where we are now, is it, as far
That's
as EPUT
right,
is
yeah.
concerned? Before I move on, sorry, that can come down, thank you, Amanda, and that's the majority of that documentation. What role has the CPA played in other assessments during the relevant period? And by that I mean gatekeeping assessments or Mental Health Act assessments or specialist assessments?
I think CPA has been the cornerstone of all the assessments. It's a national document which has dictated the care, the treatment, and the initial assessments. So the other services have developed their own specialist assessments, but based on the CPA principles.
In providing your statement to the inquiry and in providing the documentation, you've only provided CPA or non-CPA documentation. In answer to one of my questions a while ago, you explained that you would understand why the other specialist assessments or different assessments would have their own documentation. Is there some reason why we haven't got that documentation? Is there other documentation for the other assessments?
I've included some specialist assessments, some information on the specialist assessments in my statement.
You
so
have.
An assessment for an autism assessment would be a completely different assessment. An assessment for ADHD would be a different assessment. Eating disorder services would have their own different assessments. So these are not overall psychiatric sort of assessments. These are specialist assessments for specialist purposes.
What about gatekeeping assessments?
Gatekeeping assessment is more or less the core psychiatric assessment.
Is there documentation relating to gatekeeping assessments?
We use the same V1, V6 and the 2.1 form. The teams, the crisis response teams and the gatekeeping teams might have their own headings or slight different versions, but the approach and the layout is pretty much based on the CPA.
What status does the CPA have now then? We've looked at this documentation in EPUT's delivery of mental health care. Is it still the main approach?
It is still the main approach.
Your statement makes no reference to the community mental health framework. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, we have a community framework implementation and transformation program. We have implemented some aspects of it. For example, better integration with the primary care. I think almost all services in Essex now have a primary care nursing teams. One of our areas, West Essex, was one of the 11 pilot sites, and they're focused on the physical and the mental health integration. And there's a joint care coordination center with both physical and mental health nurses. So GPs require any care for whether it's physical or mental, it'll go to that common coordination center. But the core component of moving away from CPA has been a challenge. It is a significantly major project. We have done a lot of base work. We've got the new plans, CPA care plans, which incorporate the outcome measures. We are not behind. There are certain IT challenges where, as a result of which, the new care plans have not been uploaded and implemented. These IT glitches are being worked through, especially with one of the IT providers. We are in the process of implementing the move away from CPA. The patients are used to having a care coordinator, so it's how we manage. It's a significant change in the country. One of the things which is very close to patients in the community mental health team is they ask for a care coordinator. And if you're moving away from a care coordinator, it has to be done carefully, and we are on that journey.
Can I ask?
We should be able to provide the transformation plans if the inquiry team needs them.
Is there any engagement, for example, in replacing the categorization of CPA and non-CPA, which is something indicated?
So the move away from CPA section is about moving away from the care program approach and not having a CPA and non-CPA. It relies, the idea is to provide an intervention-based treatment rather than a continuum. However, there's an acknowledgement that certain patients, a complex, would require some element of care coordination.
And you say you can provide the inquiry with the information of the transformation and what is being
That's
done
correct.
so far.
That's correct.
Can I move on then quickly to touch upon some aspects of risk assessment? We've already looked at your paragraph 15, and you referred to what is required for a risk management plan. You said, regarding risk assessment, a comprehensive history eliciting various risk and mitigating factors, along with detailed mental state examination, is key in understanding the risks and formulating a risk management plan. What information do you say should be gathered on a risk assessment in order to obtain a comprehensive history about a patient?
So our risk assessment section is at the bottom of the full comprehensive assessment. So only after undertaking a full comprehensive assessment can one provide a formulation of what the risk is. And I gave you an example around a person presenting with a self-harm episode, how you'd want to, in addition to knowing whether the person has a mental illness, because that's all the aspects that are mentioned here are relevant to understanding a risk. If you take past history, has the person taken overdoses in the past? How serious have they been? Have they required inpatient admission every time? Does the patient not have, are these in context of his or her depressive symptoms, depressive illness, or are they in context of her personality profiling? So each aspect, substance misuse, you can't undertake a full risk assessment unless you understand a substance misuse history. Alcohol alters human beings' perception, your thinking, your mood. Is the person drinking alcohol to cope with the depressive symptoms, or is the alcohol itself as being seen as depressant is contributing to the depression? So you can't undertake an assessment in isolation. Forensic history, does the person become a risk to others because of his hallucinations or the paranoia or not? And that, again, you have to take a forensic history. So the point I'm trying to make is risk assessment is just a formulation and summarization of a comprehensive, detailed assessment. It is important to know a person. If you don't know what his strengths, what his weaknesses are, what his support network is, you can't get an idea about what the risks are and how we're going to manage those risks.
Can I just pick up on a specific issue? Presumably you would add to that list, it's relevant for an autism diagnosis or suspected autism diagnosis to require consideration as part of a risk assessment.
Absolutely.
And can I ask you this, what procedures or specialist input is in place or has been in place at EPUT to ensure that particular aspect, autism or potential autism or suspected autism, is incorporated in a risk assessment?
So autism is, so when we talk about, we don't, in the risk assessment, we don't talk about conditions or schizophrenia, or it's a condition. And I think the training provided to the staff, the Oliver McGovern training, is about being mindful and being aware of what the presentation is, how you undertake an assessment for someone who is autistic in a calm environment with someone who's there because they don't like change, where be mindful of the communication challenges. An autistic person saying that I'm suicidal is to be taken very seriously because of the concrete way of thinking, whereas sometimes people use these terms, I wish I don't wake up early, it's an oblique hint, may not mean that he's wanting to end his life. The certain behaviors in terms of how they downregulate themselves when they're stressed, all these are part of a training. When you give a diagnosis, depression, risk of suicide are higher. Schizophrenia, risk of suicide are higher. Autism, definitely. Eating disorders is a high risk. So that's just one aspect of the assessment of risk. And we know that, as you mentioned, autism definitely needs to be considered because there are lots of challenges autistic person would face, and one needs to be mindful of those.
At paragraph 106 of your statement, you say that the details of the risk assessment and ongoing risk should clearly be evidenced in the case notes. At EPUT, are patients' notes checked or audited to check that that's happening, to ensure that it's happening?
It takes us back to Dr. Davidson's argument. It's the reliance on risk assessment being done and giving a false sense of security. It's been done. How it's done is more important than whether it's done or not. The two aspects to it. One is the quantitative aspects, whether the assessment's been done, and these are you'll undertake audits around risk assessment completed or not. That will not give us an idea, feel of whether that assessment was meaningful. And therefore, there are several tiers and layers in any mental health services. So if for trainees, for doctors, there'll always be a consultant available for discussion. They'll have one-to-one supervision where they'd be expected to discuss these cases. Each team, as a crisis team, every new patient will be discussed in the morning. And you may not look at the form, but you get an idea in the way the person is presenting the history, whether he's undertaken a comprehensive assessment and a risk assessment. In mental health teams, which they meet once a week, all new cases would be, the nurses, whoever undertakes an assessment, will be expected to discuss. That's where you get a idea of a quality. It's very difficult to audit a quality at an organization level, because you may check the forms, and the forms might be half filled, but is it because the patient was not cooperative, or is it because... So
I don't want to interrupt you, but my question was around what's recorded in the records. Your statement says that details of the risk assessment and ongoing risk should clearly be evidenced. So that is the information that was obtained as part of the risk assessment. Would that, for example, include emails that had been sent in about a patient?
No. Person would take that into consideration in undertaking a risk assessment. So look at if there are any notes. A person has written some final notes or suicide note, as you would call it, or any emails, any information that's been shared from the family, but you wouldn't necessarily include it in the clinical records. Your assessment records.
So I can understand, are you saying that information provided by the family or emails or correspondence might not appear in the details of the risk assessment that's recorded in the case notes?
They would inform the risk assessment. So if you when you talk to the family, you listen to what the family has mentioned, and you would expect either document that in the family has expressed concerns, or family has shared that X and Y happened. A family has shared that this person has been aggressive towards X family member. That will be taken into consideration, but you wouldn't just copy an email and put in an assessment.
Just briefly, because I note it may be time for a short break, can I just ask you about assessment tools? You observe that in addition, this is at paragraph 33 for those following, that in addition to the trust assessment documents described, clinicians also use a range of tools which inform the overall assessment. And at paragraph 34, you observe that the Trust's current clinical assessment and safety management policy, which is your MK15, outlines that risk assessment tools should not be used on their own. You've already touched on this, I think, earlier, but as part of a comprehensive assessment at points of key decision making. You say that some of the tools require specialist knowledge, and to the best of your knowledge, there's no single universally accepted standardized tool to assess suicide risk. At paragraph 36 of your statement, you list some of the tools, including at the bottom of what is our page 1045, the Early Intervention Suicide Risk Assessment Tool. Can I just ask you some brief questions? Firstly, how in practice, when you're there on the ground, so to speak, are these tools accessed by healthcare practitioners, and for whom are they accessible? Who can access those tools?
So there are tools which certain specialist teams will use. So this is any early intervention psychosystem will have their own sets of tools and forms which they will use. they would be available and accessible to that team. But if it goes on an electronic record, those electronic records are accessible to whoever who needs to access those records.
You've talked about some tools require specialist knowledge. Is that, do you say, related to the teams, or is specialist training provided?
Specialist training. HCR20 is an excellent example, and it's one of the reliable assessment tools, a historical risk management tool. It requires training.
And who provides that training?
It could be internal, it could be external. Forensic services, they are the ones who, every patient who's taken on a secure unit will have HCR20, so there's an internal HCR20 training program. So you might want to undertake training programs provided by the Royal College or external training as well.
If, as you say, there's no single universally accepted standardized tool to assess suicide risk, how does a practitioner or a healthcare practitioner at EPUT determine, how do they decide which tool to use?
As mentioned earlier, it's undertaking a comprehensive psychiatric assessment. It's a skill. It's understanding a person, understanding the context, the strengths, vulnerabilities, the psychosocial factors influencing, playing at the time, the role of a mental illness, and at the end you document. So all our forms are, the core assessment forms have risk assessment at the bottom, which means that we expect a person to undertake a psychiatric assessment before completing that risk assessment section.
So when you say that it's used occasionally, I think those are the words in your statement, what do you mean by, why is that tool only used occasionally?
Sorry, Evan.
Sorry, at the bottom of the paragraph, at your 36, you say that the early intervention suicide risk assessment tool is used occasionally. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
That's an early intervention risk assessment. It's a specific tool I'm not familiar with, but they're tools that probably they're using in their own specific team. Early intervention psychosis patients, they will deal with patients who present with psychosis, and they would probably want to focus risks in relation to a psychotic presentation, which would be slightly different to a risk of suicide. So, or the patient's schizophrenia, psychosis, I think we're going in specifics here, the risk of suicide in terms of voices asking them to harm themselves or others, or when you recover from a psychotic episode and you realize the impact of the illness and the whole life, the post-psychotic depression. So there are certain elements which might be very specific. I'm assuming here because I haven't seen that tool, but that is not a generic suicide assessment tool. That is maybe specific to that particular. That would not replace a comprehensive psychiatric assessment and understanding of a patient.
Chair, we've been going, I think, for about an hour and a half. Would it be a short break for 10 minutes?
Perfect. 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Dr. Corrali, can I move to a different topic now, which is the question of referrals and screening in relation to assessments. We've already seen, and we don't need to look at them again, from the various documents that you will get, or referrals can come from a number of different, from a whole variety of sources, and those include GPs, social services, neighbours, family, organisations, and so on. At your paragraph 47, you pick up the wording from the SEPT policy, and you say, it is important to establish that the referrals are eligible for assessment by the mental health team practitioner receiving the referral. And later on you say, a screening assessment should be carried out, and the outcome of this assessment should determine whether further CPA assessment is required. So put shortly, is this in effect an assessment as to whether there should be an assessment?
It'll depend on the team. For non-urgent care pathways, primary care, when a referral used, and this is, we're talking about time at the time when GPs used to refer patients to the mental health team, they would do an initial screening of the referral letters. GPs would write a letter and see whether the information was adequate to make a decision. That would be an opportunity for the person who was undertaking that screening to ask for more information if required, and then to decide who is the best person placed in the team to undertake that assessment if required. I gave an example at the time, and this distinction is probably not there now, but at one stage there's a distinction between mental health services providing severe and enduring treatment for severe and enduring mental illness, and primary care managing most of the depression and common mental illnesses. Dr. Davidson also draws that distinction between severe mental illness and common mental illness. And that referral was a way of screening that, establishing whether the thresholds were met, the adequate information was there, and who was the best person placed to undertake, and how soon the assessment needs to undertake.
So various elements, more information, or whether you need more information, who are the best team, whether there should be an assessment at all.
Or not. That's true. This has changed, evolved over time, and again, as I said, if you look at the urgent care pathways, the screening undertaken by the crisis response service now is more comprehensive because we're dealing with urgent matters. So different teams have different screening processes.
I'll come back to that in a moment.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you about the clinical assessment service, which appears in the SEPT handbook in 2007? First of all, what is the clinical assessment service?
So SEPT, in the community mental health team, they had a section of the community mental health team who would specialize in undertaking assessments. They were called clinical assessment. It's called clinical assessment service. It consisted of a group of nurses, senior nurses, who would be allocated to take the initial assessment, the comprehensive assessment. Over a period of time, they realized that they were undertaking assessments, and the teams, then the patients were then waiting for allocation in the community mental health team. So that was then changed to a first response team, which meant that those people, the staff member who were undertaking the assessment, could provide some brief interventions and treatment. And the teams got divided into a first response team and a more comprehensive treatment team. The idea was that in the mental health team, when the patients were referred, they would stay in for a very long time. And is there a group of patients who can be managed quickly, provided an intervention, and discharged back to the GP? And that was the concept of CAS. It used to be called Clinical Assessment Service, leading to the first response and recovery team. They were called recovery teams. We are back to the community mental health team now. And I think there was something similar in North Essex.
In relation to NEPT, you identify in your statement that all referrals at NEPT went to a single point of contact. Can you help or not? Was there screening at NEPT, or was that just a case of managing and making sure the referrals went to the right teams?
I can only talk of when we took over, when EPUT was formed. NEP had a clinical, has an access and assessment service team, which we would receive requests for assessments, and they would undertake the initial assessments. That team again has been dismantled and back into the community mental health team. But prior to that, I'm not sure what the function, how the referrals were screened.
Dealing then with EPA, which is an area you say I think you can help. You say at your paragraph 54, all referrals are considered against service criteria to maximise the availability of the service. Screening of the referral will take place to determine an outcome. And at your paragraph 60, you say the screener reviewing the initial referral will review the available information against the criteria of the service to which the referral has been made. Screeners have knowledge of other trust services to make an informed decision on the referral outcome, and an outcome of the screening can include the referral being forwarded to a more appropriate team. When you make reference to service criteria, do you mean the criteria for which the team that it's being referred to, or the...
So if patients would be referred to a mental health services for various reasons, if the say for example, a patient is referred from psychological interventions, then those referrals would be forwarded to the psychological services. Or a crisis response service receiving a referral might feel that the home treatment team is a better team to provide that input, and would divert that referral to that team. So teams would identify which team is best placed to undertake a comprehensive assessment if needed and provide the treatment.
So is the service criteria the criteria to the proposed team?
Yes.
Thank you. Is the more appropriate team the team that it is the referral is then forwarded to? Are they obliged to report back to the screener and say whether they've taken the patient?
Yes, there should be some way of acknowledging that the referral has been accepted.
So not just acknowledgement of receipt, but of acceptance.
Accepted, yeah. The responsibility, I mean, generally in medicine, when you make a referral, good medical practice suggests that until the referral has the referring team has accepted, the person referring or the team referring continues to have some responsibility. You cannot. You need to hand over the case and ensure that the referral or the care has been accepted by the team.
How are decisions made to accept or reject at the screening stage? You said that one of the options was that there shouldn't be an assessment at all.
It would be based on the clinical presentation, and teams or whoever is undertaking that assessment would have an option of gathering more information. There are now some specific tools used. For example, crisis response team uses a tool which categorizes, how soon the assessment needs to take place, and which team needs to take. So they use A, B, C, D, and A. So A is where patient needs to be seen urgently. B is within 4 hours. C between 12 hours. But then the rest of them are probably not suitable for that service, and they are diverted to some other services. So each team would have a way of identifying. Predominantly, it will be based on the clinical presentation.
Sorry.
And if the information is not there, request more information. So you have the person who's making that decision has a good understanding of how soon the patient needs to be seen, or whether the patient needs to be seen.
Is there any concern that screening runs the risk of people being turned away, or people who need help being turned away?
If you look at the number of referrals that are coming to mental health services, there has to be some way of managing those referrals. And it's a dialogue. If the referral is not accepted from a primary care, now every primary care, the referrals come through the primary care nurses, psychiatric nurses. If a primary care psychiatric nurse refers a patient to secondary care, there would be a dialogue between the two. But to accept every referral that is coming in, we don't have the resources to manage that.
Well, that leads me on to my next question, which is to what extent are referrals rejected at the screening stage due to funding or resource considerations?
Should be a clinical decision rather than a resource decision. What tends to happen at times is the risk of developing waiting lists and patients waiting for a long period. ADHD and ASD assessments are excellent examples. The patients wait for ASD for 5 years.
We'll come back to that in a moment. But in light of what you've just said, do you have a sense or do you consider that referrals are rejected to stop services becoming overstretched sometimes?
It's a difficult question to answer. It shouldn't happen, and it's the responsibility of a clinician who's undertaking that assessment to make a well-informed clinical judgment to decide whether the referral is and the person requires an assessment, who's the best team to assess, and how soon the person should be assessed.
In your statement, you refer to key performance indicators, KPIs. Can I just ask, actually, very briefly, that we put up your table 3, which is the statement bundle at 10:52, the core bundle at 10:52. You've made reference to these already, in fact, or in passing, I think, some of the times. There we can see some of the, as I say, the KPIs, which is, in terms of screening, crisis response services, trust monitor the number of calls which are answered within 60 seconds, hospital liaison services, trust aims to triage a referral from the general ward in acute hospital within 1 hour, dementia intensive support services, initial contact following an urgent referral within 24 hours, and then following a routine referral within 72 hours. And then eating orders, contact for 18 to 25 within 48 hours.
This is not comprehensive, and each team would have, so for CMHT is 28 days assessment, so I just want to clarify that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is not a comprehensive
Not a
table
comprehensive
you make clear, but my question is this. Do you think matters such as response times and the monitoring of the response times undermine the efficiency and integrity of the service because people are concerned about meeting the KPIs?
Once a clinician starts undertaking an assessment, he would want to undertake a comprehensive assessment because it's his clinical assessment and judgment. It would put pressure on the teams because of the number of referrals that are coming in. But if a patient requires and deserves an assessment, the team should offer an assessment.
Do you think that the screeners are ever influenced by these KPIs in terms of where they actually agree that someone will be referred to?
It's a difficult question to answer. They shouldn't. If a patient requires an assessment and your team is the best team to offer an assessment, then you would offer an assessment. And the likelihood is that the patient will have to wait or may go on a waiting list. But just rejecting a referral because you've got time pressures to meet.
I was also thinking about whether they might send to a different service, not necessarily the optimal service.
The different service would be smart enough, I would presume, not to accept and point it back to the referral, saying that your team is the best place to accept that.
Sorry.
Some specific questions then about the screening. You have repeatedly said that it's open to the screener to get more information. Can you give me an example of the circumstances in which further information might be sought? Sorry, the slide can come down now, thank you.
It's common practice for the screeners to contact the GP asking for more information if the referral letter as not comprehensive. Now it's the primary care liaison nurses, but at the time when the referrals used to come from GP, you used to ask for more information. There are the crisis team. If a patient is referred to the crisis team by a GP, they would often try to get more information from the GP. Sometimes key information is missing about patient details, or in order for the team to contact the patient. So it is not uncommon for the referral to go back to the person who's referred to, assess referred to go back to the referrer.
And what are the expectations on staff, though, for other information? What if the patient, for example, is not registered with a GP? Or what about contacting the family? Would screeners look for further information from a family or carer?
They would.
So they would?
I'll give you an example. For eating disorder assessments, if there is a request for an admission to an eating disorder unit, it's common practice for the consultant or the whoever is there, to contact the family, the parents, get more information, because they're relying on a form rather than the decision to be made on a form. So they've sent some information. It's a nationally recognized form, but they have to contact the family, the parents, the mother.
You give eating disorder as an example, but what about in other cases? Is there a provision? Is there a procedure by which family can offer further information at the screening stage?
It's very difficult at the time when you receive a referral, how much involvement the patient wants to have from the family. It's good practice to contact, but it would be good practice to actually talk to the patient first. So the patient's aware that someone's talking to the family and shouldn't come as a surprise to the patient. Screening is just gathering, most of the time it's just gathering more information and deciding who's best placed to undertake that assessment.
Do you have
as a part of the assessment, especially in a mental health team, one would gather more information from the family members. Sometimes family members come with the patient, and you would then
Sorry, you're talking about the assessment now, aren't you? I'm asking you about the screening stage and the extent to which it might be obtained at the screening stage to prevent people falling through the gaps at the screening stage.
It would be neat. I don't think it'll happen routinely if required. I can think of mental health act assessments where the AMPs would contact the family member for information. It's a legal requirement. It's a requirement under the code of practice as well. So certain assessments more geared towards gathering more information from the family.
Again, we're talking now at the screening stage, okay. which was what. Just in terms of communicating screening outcomes, you deal with that at your paragraph 59. We know that to the crisis resolution and home treatment teams, they're required to contact patients within 4 hours of referrals. Non-urgent outcomes are by letter. Can you help us? What's the basis for setting the 4-hour response time for the CHRT?
It's the maximum. If talking to the crisis team, and I've worked in the crisis team, if a referral is urgent, they would contact the patient straight away. So it is. I'm not sure what is the reason for setting that 4-hour target.
Your paragraph 61, you say that where physical health is deemed to take priority, that the patient's physical needs will be dealt with first, in effect. Can I just ask you this, at the screening stage, if it's been identified that mental health input may be needed as well, how is that recorded? How is the need to refer to the mental health liaison team when well enough physically recorded? How do we make sure that the patient stays in the system at that point?
So can you explain?
Yes, at 61, you say there are occasions when reviewing the referral and engaging with the patient, the screener determines that the patient's primary need is physical health care. In such cases, a joint decision is made with the patient to redirect them to appropriate services to address this need first, with mental health assessment to follow thereafter. And you go on then to say that once they're stabilised, they can be referred to the mental health liaison team. I've jumped forward to the end there.
So
How is it ensured that the patient stays within the system and then moves to the mental health liaison team?
I think this primarily refers to the urgent care department. We do a screening as soon as a patient comes in. And if a patient has taken an overdose, or we think that the the physical health needs are such that the patient needs to be treated in the acute hospital, because it refers to the mental health liaison teams which are based in the acute hospitals, the patient would be sent to A&E or acute hospital, get the medical treatment, and we can ask our liaison teams to assess the patient there.
Can I ask you about your paragraph 63, in which you say prior to the formation of the current trust urgent care pathways to which you've been referring, patients in crisis were advised to attend A&E departments in the acute hospitals and were supported in the community by primary and secondary care services. First of all, what is the when did the urgent care pathway come into existence?
So this is before the before the establishment of CRHT's, crisis resolution home treatment teams. Patients did not have. There was no urgent care team. The subsequent next thing was the patients would even with the crisis teams, the patients during the working hours, crisis teams would be the teams dealing with the urgency. But in the evenings after crisis working hours, patients only had option of going to the A&E accident emergency. The accident emergency services at the time would have a liaison nurse.
Sorry, I don't want to cut across you.
Sorry.
My question was when that changed.
I think that has evolved over a period of time with crisis teams, then subsequently the crisis response services, which now became 24-hour service, and then now the urgent care department, where patients can just walk in to access that service. So it's been a journey from not having any crisis urgent care services to establishing some urgent care services through the crisis CRHTs working 9 to 5, not weekends, to CRHTs working weekends, to even CRHTs required patients to be referred by GP or a professional. Now CRS is where 111 to anyone. You don't need to go through a mental health professional. You can just pick up a phone, dial 1112, and you will be put to a mental health professional. So that's been a journey for the mental health services.
Can I move then to the arrangements for assessment? At paragraph 65, you say once the decision is made to assess the individual and the purpose is established, the assessment will be arranged in line with the screening outcome, identified risk, and the relevant service pathway, taking into account expected timelines and target KPIs for assessment delivery. Would you agree that that reads like an aspirational paragraph?
The KPIs are monitored and they would be breaches, especially for 28 days in community mental. Those are monitored.
In terms, going.
I was just thinking,
If that's what should happen.
as a clinician, when I'm being referred a patient, I'm less likely to think about the KPI and the patient needs to be seen, and that is one would expect from a clinician, from a clinical perspective.
My question is 65 looks to be a paragraph of what should happen rather than what actually happens every time. You asked me to identify them when I asked at the beginning. And that was, I asked whether you agreed with that as a proposition.
Yes, I can take that. It can be.
I'm sorry, I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to move quickly through. You move on to arrangements for assessment. and start off with location. We are now at the point where the patient has got through screening and a formal assessment has been arranged. From 67 to 69, you deal with where assessments can be carried out. There's a variety of possibilities. And at paragraph 70, you set out the advantages of doing so in a patient's own home where possible. And can I just clarify that with you? Because that would, wouldn't it, on many occasions, afford the opportunity to obtain information from the family and the support network. At paragraph 72, you say that there is often time required following assessment to liaise with, and you say, significant others. Can I just explore who that might mean? Would that include family, significant others?
Family, GP.
GP, who else?
Carers, if a person is living in a care home or residential home. Some care agencies are involved. So it could involve a number of other people. Some voluntary agencies.
This is terminology you also use. I won't take you there later on when you're talking about gatekeeping assessments. And it's the same principle then, isn't it?
That's right.
Who takes responsibility for liaising with significant others if the assessment is for admission in an out-of-area place?
Assessment for out-of-area placement.
Is it still the same clinician?
So you would want to admit the patient closest to the patient's home, and only if a bed is not available and the patient requires a bed urgently, that you go out of area. So the out of area assessment should not be different to an assessment undertaken to admit a patient locally.
Is there greater expectation that there will be liaison with others in a case where the patient lacks capacity?
Yes.
It's clear from your paragraphs 73 and 75 to 75 that patient involvement is key, and again at page 76 onwards, your statement recognises the importance, as we've said, of family and carer involvement. Can I just ask this, were there any relevant national or local standards or protocols or guidance or best practice at the relevant time which informed how to involve family and carer in these assessments, family and carers in these assessments?
For Mental Health Act, there's a code of practice. The AMP is expected to contact the family members. And for other assessments, I'm not aware of any document, but it is a common practice. Even on our assessment forms, we have a section of family and carers' views and opinions and patients' views and opinions. So it is accepted, it's part of a standard, wherever possible you want to get information from the family.
Do you think it would help at working level if there was more specific guidance drafted or available to practitioners about getting family involvement, about what to do with the information, raising the expectations?
The CPA and other documents do mention about the importance of, so there are policies and procedures around stressing the importance of family involvement and gathering information from the family. And as a clinician, I would want to know what's happening at home and because sometimes patients are paranoid, psychotic, they don't want to give you information, and the only source of information then is family members or others as I mentioned. Family patient involvement can be very variable. We have to undertake assessments even when patients at times don't want to. It's less likely to happen in other specialities.
At paragraph 77, you note that consent to share information with a person's family and carer must be obtained, and patients give varying levels of consent. Do you accept, however, that there are fewer obstacles to receiving information and listening to carers?
Absolutely.
And is this stressed to those that undertake assessments at EPUT?
Yes, we've had a number of training sessions as well, and that's one of the issues in mental health. I think Dr. Davidson also touched on it. There's a feeling among a number of clinicians that a patient doesn't want you to talk to the family means you can't even gather information. And we've had training sessions even with legal professionals explaining what what consent means.
And does that training stress the importance of
Absolutely.
engaging?
Absolutely.
In terms of those who are involved in the criminal justice system, we've already talked about other agencies. At the time or over the relevant period, have you ever had a protocol or memorandum of understanding with external agencies, the police or probation, as to how you'll deal with them?
Yes, there are memorandum of understandings. And
There are there?
Yeah.
Are they in existence now?
ISAs, they call also. There is information sharing agreements between various professionals, various organizations.
And are
There should be.
they apply at the moment?
There should be ISAs with different organizations. There's an ISA with sharing
you
agreements with police,
And you could provide those if required?
the trust should be able to provide those.
If a person who presents for mental health assessment is also facing criminal proceedings, does this affect their access to obtaining the assessment?
The purpose of the assessment is important. Is it a forensic assessment? And what's the purpose? The forensic assessments could be to assist the court in understanding the person or diverting the patient. But if a person has an offending history, that shouldn't preclude that person from accessing mental health services. In fact, forensic history forms a core component of a psychiatric assessment.
In terms of the assessment itself, which healthcare professionals can carry out those assessments?
The forensic assessments.
No, the first mental health assessments that we're talking about following
A qualified clinician. It could be a doctor, a nurse, a psychologist, a social worker. They need to have qualifications. We don't non-qualified and medical students do not undertake assessments on their own.
And who can make a decision to admit?
They are decision makers. They would be qualified nurses. They're decision-making teams and the staff working in those teams. So the gatekeepers, decision-making teams, the crisis resolution home treatment. So the nurses working in the crisis team, the consultant for the crisis team, the crisis response services, the mental health A&E, urgent care mental health department, and the for elderly care, the intensive support team. So the staff working there would be the staff who would make that decision whether to admit or not to admit.
You make reference in your statement to limitations to assessment. That's your phraseology. You deal with non-engagement, including patient choice. You make a number of references to non-engagement in your statement. Is there a reason you've played emphasis on that? Do EPUT focus on non-engagement?
Engagement of a patient is a core component of a psychiatric assessment. We stress too much on whether we're able to build a rapport with the patient because it gives us a lot of information about the patient. A paranoid patient will not want to sort of talk to you, whereas a manic patient would want to give you a lot of information, and it's a skill how you contain that and gather the information in a relevant period. An anxious person may want to spend a lot of time, assessment time, seeking reassurance. So the patient's engagement is a key component of understanding the patient's presentation and also helps us in planning subsequent treatment.
You deal at paragraph 87 very specifically with intoxication. For those working at EPUT, when presented with intoxication, what factors would inform the decision as to whether to proceed with the mental health assessment?
It's a clinical decision. If the clinician feels that the patient is sober enough or you are able to undertake an assessment, you would undertake an assessment. It's not an exclusion. It's not a criteria for not to take an assessment. However, there are merits in undertaking an assessment once person is more cooperative. Alcohol colors our perception, our influences our thought process, and some who might be feel quite hopeless when in an intoxicated state might have a different mental state after the effects of alcohol wear off. But it's not an exclusion criteria.
Are you aware of patients being refused assessments because they are intoxicated, or because someone has incorrectly judged that they're intoxicated?
Not that I'm aware of. It used to be a practice many years ago, not in mental health services, where patient intoxication and there's an understanding, patient needs to be completely sober before an assessment takes place. So mental health services have moved on from that position.
You refer to neurodiversity, and you've acknowledged earlier on that an assessment involves identifying social and psychological factors contributing or leading to the presentation. Would you agree it's important and relevant to identify the presence of those kind of conditions at the outset?
It is. One needs to be mindful of these conditions. You may not diagnose, but you are aware of these, and you provide a needs-based care because their needs would be somewhat different.
Are there procedures in place to support clinicians identify those at the time of assessment?
The McGowan training and the training forms a part of that.
I think we'll hear evidence about the McGowan training tomorrow, but you've said twice that is what you rely on as indicating that staff are equipped to deal with these issues.
Certain services where they're likely to face more patients with autism, like CAM services, they have their own bespoke training, and I've provided some evidence in terms of the training they provide. It's a 2-day training at induction for every staff member who works on a CAMS unit. Likewise, the learning disability services, where it's more likely present.
As I say, we'll come back to that tomorrow. I don't want to cut across you. Are reasonable adjustments made for those that require them for neurodevelopmental conditions at the assessment period?
Reasonable adjustments should be made.
Are you aware to what extent that has been happening at EPUT?
We have sensory rooms in most of the places. There are sensory aids and tools. There in a number of places there are. It's especially on camps. It's documented. Close the door slowly because of the number of patients who have autism. So there is an increased awareness about these conditions. And provisions made.
You emphasise feigning and malingering in your statement. Is this a particular challenge for EPUT?
It's something one needs to be mindful of. It's something probably more common in not common. You're likely to face in forensic services, where to avoid legal dealings with the legal services that one might want to go down the health route.
Is it monitored by EPUT?
It's not monitored by EPUT. It's a clinical decision and a clinical judgment.
Just in terms of an outcome of assessment, you note that individuals may, this is at paragraph 93, that individuals sometimes may wish to raise concerns, and you say that the services have systems and processes in place. Can you explain the systems and processes in place at EPUT for peer discussion and review for people to raise concerns about the outcome of assessments?
The patient can raise concerns with the clinician who is assessing him, can raise concerns with PALS, and there are patients who write to the headquarters directly. Patients can go through, often there's a complaints procedure for raising concerns. For doctors, it would be the clinical directors who would deal with the complaints and offer second opinions or address these issues raised in the concerns, and likewise similar managers for other professionals.
So you're dealing with making the arrangements for making a complaint, in effect.
You'd want to deal with it at an informal level and address it at a local level.
You also recognise at your paragraph 94 that families have concerns and that they may be urgent, and you make reference to on-call arrangements. How was the on-call arrangement or the availability to speak to somebody urgently, how was that communicated to patients or carers?
This is for the out of hours assessments. If the families have concerns, the families necessarily wouldn't know about the on-call consultants, but I do take that point. They probably wouldn't be aware of the on-call consultants and the on-call managers.
So they wouldn't be aware.
They
of
would
how to
go through the
contact
PALs and yeah.
So, but that wouldn't be an urgent. That wouldn't be an urgent response, would it, to go through PALs?
That wouldn't be an urgent. Yeah.
Again, mindful of the time, can I just ask you about some of the types of assessments that you have referred to? You say that there are 1,500 types of assessments. Why so many?
I think this is over 20 years. I presume because before the electronic records, there used to be paper records. And my understanding is that there were several iterations and teams would have changed their forms slightly. But with electronic, but still there are a large number of forms in the mental health services. This is because they are forms for specific conditions. You'd want, and if a falls assessment, there's a separate falls. If there's a thromboembolism, there's a separate form. There's separate forms for each conditions. Each professions have their own. Psychologists will have a battery of their forms. Occupational therapists will have their forms to assess persons, whatever they assess. The social workers will have their assessments. And in addition, there are scales and tools which are often used as assessment forms. So there is a large number of assessments forms in mental health.
Can I ask you quickly, please, about gatekeeping assessments? Again, I'll just give you talk about them at paragraph 120 as an assessment undertaken to access an inpatient bed. To what extent are gatekeeping assessments used to reduce bed use?
I think the reduction or management of beds doesn't happen at a gatekeeping. It happens now at a SITRIP and a management at a bed management level. The gatekeeping assessment would decide what's the best place to treat a patient.
I'm again mindful of the time. Just note that you have a table at Appendix 2 of your statement for those following in documentations. That's 1094. Who makes the referrals to the gatekeeping teams?
Anyone for crisis response services, even a patient can call 111, dial 2 and ask for an assessment. Families, GPs, other professionals.
Is there a screening process for gatekeeping assessments?
The crisis CRS screening tool is a fairly comprehensive tool, gathering the current presentation, the past history, medications. It's almost a mini assessment. So there is a screening tool for these gatekeeping assessments.
We've touched on this. Is there documentation, policies, procedures, guidance, handbooks to govern gatekeeping assessments?
The teams would have their own operational policies and procedures for gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is just a term used for an assessment that decides whether that particular service is going to accept that patient.
As we just looked at, as identified in your statement. But you say that those teams will have their documentation.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah.
And you could provide that to the inquiry as requested?
Yes, we should be able to, for the gatekeeping teams.
Is there a standard template used for gatekeeping?
The crisis response services have their template, and the CRHTs use the template, so there are templates for those assessments. They are not different to, as I mentioned, the two core assessment forms. We base these forms predominantly on those core psychiatric assessment forms.
If a person or if a gatekeeping assessment determines not to admit, is that in effect overruling the referral from the team that made it?
But that's one of the options available. You know, they can be managed. They can be with the home treatment team, if that's the best option. That the patient can be treated at home safely, or there could be other services. We've got crisis cafes, or crisis homes in Essex. Sometimes they accept certain patients for managing brief crisis. So there are various options available.
At paragraph 123, you say the patient will be actively involved in the decisions about their care. With their consent, family members and significant others may be included. When you're considering an assessment for an admission into hospital, do EPUT consider that obtaining collateral information from family and carers, say, and from other agencies, the need to be heightened at that stage, to be even more important?
Yes, if available. A lot of patients, we may not always be able to contact family members. Patient may not have family members as well.
How long would you expect a gatekeeping assessment to last for?
Standard 1 hour, depending upon the patient's presentation anyway, so that's.
I appreciate you haven't been asked for precise information, but are gatekeeping assessments evaluated, monitored for the number of referrals, the proportion of referrals, the number of admissions, the proportion of admissions? Is that type of monitoring and information available?
So the number of referrals and the time in which they are undertaken, they are KPIs. The outcomes in terms of the once a decision is made to admit the patient, there's a flow and capacity process, which I think I've covered in my second statement. But I'm happy to discuss if you want to take it through what happens.
We'll deal with your
tomorrow.
second statement tomorrow. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time, Chair, aware of the need for others to be able to communicate, and also the finish time of 5 o'clock. Can I just ask you some brief questions about Mental Health Act assessments? You deal with these in your statement in any event. You've already touched on the importance of obtaining information from family and carers in relation to mental health assessments. And I think you referenced the code of practice. But can I ask you this? What should the AMP do in practice if subsequent to an assessment they contact the nearest relative, or a relative provides them with significant information that contradicts information that was provided by the patient? Is there some procedure by which decisions can be revisited?
The AMPs usually contact the family before the assessment together. As a part of gathering relevant information, they would contact GP, whoever they can, and then have that information for the 2 doctors who would go and assess the patient with the AMP. So AMP's one of the core responsibilities to gather as much information before an assessment takes place.
In terms of other specialist assessments, you deal with in your statement diagnostic assessments, memory assessments, eating disorder assessments, but you also issue assessments of divergence, which are very specialised assessments. Can I just ask you, in the last couple of minutes, 1 or 2 questions about this?
Please.
You observe that a delay to wait for an assessment of neurodivergence, I think you've managed, is 4 years.
5 years.
5 years.
Yes. So So there are, when you talk about neurodivergence, the ASD service and ADHD services are two distinct, although they're managed, and I think it's slightly confusing. I apologize for the way it's been worded, that it combined. But the ASD services in the south and northeast and the ADHD services are two separate services. The waiting period of 4 or 5 years is for the ASD service. ADHD is still, it's slightly less than that.
But still a long time.
Still a long time.
Can I just ask you this, in light of what is a very lengthy waiting period, would you agree that it's really important then to implement reasonable adjustments and factor in those possible diagnoses, even when it hasn't been made, when you're considering mental health assessments?
Absolutely.
And admission?
It's a needs-based rather than a diagnostic-based because of the long wait.
And you referred at paragraph 175 to collateral information being essential, which is often obtained from a family member. What were and what are EPUT doing to triangulate information from the family and the support network, particularly in the case of neurodiverse people, both at the time of a mental health assessment and then at a time of any other specialised assessment? What is happening to ensure that appropriate information, or what has been happening to ensure that appropriate information is obtained?
But other than being mindful of what needs to be considered when assessing a patient with neurodiversity, the assessment should pretty much be the same. You gather the information, you talk to the patient, you gather relevant information structured where you talk to the family, but as I said, in patients with neurodiversity, you'd ensure that someone who knows the person is there. It's done in a calm, composed way. Be mindful of the language challenges, the way they communicate. But in assessment, the core assessment would still be pretty much similar. As part of an assessment, you would want to talk to the family members where possible.
Chair, mindful of the time, unless there's anything you wish to ask at this stage.
I've got one question, if that's all right.
Yes, please.
You said earlier that out-of-area assessment shouldn't be different to an assessment undertaken to admit locally. But can I ask what you really meant by that? Is there consideration given within the general assessment about the suitability for out-of-area placement, or is it necessarily covered by the assessment, or do you mean that nothing is done to consider the specific effects of an out-of-area placement?
So, Chair, if it is for a specialist unit which is not provided locally, then yes. But if it's just for a general adult bed or a bed for an old age ward, that decision, the decision would be to admit. Whoever is assessing would not think of whether the patient goes within the locality or out of. His aim is to undertake an assessment to decide whether the patient needs a bed or not.
And would they consider the suitability of an out-of-area placement?
Out-of-area placements would, if it is required, yes. Certain specialist areas where we don't provide, if we talk about, say, an eating disorder unit, and if it's required, we don't have an eating disorder unit in psychiatric intensive care units. If our units are full, then yes, those things would be considered. I was referring more to the generic adult and old age bed admissions.
I've got no more questions.
Could we have a 10-minute break?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Ms Harris.
Thank you. Just a couple of further questions, please. Dr. Crowley, the first is this. You've given evidence about the CPA framework, and we've also referred to gatekeeping assessments. Should a gatekeeping assessment prompt the referral of a patient onto the CPA pathway in circumstances when they are not otherwise open to the community mental health team?
Yes, if they refer to the community mental health team and the team feels that the patient requires ongoing treatment, then they would go on a CPA.
We've heard reference to you seeking to implement the framework, the community mental health framework. Is there any collaboration with patients and families about how that should be done?
We'd be able to provide more information, but most of our transformation programs have patients and service users involved.
You gave evidence about the reasonable adjustments that are being made for those with developmental conditions during the assessment period. You talked about sensory rooms and other aspects. When were those reasonable adjustments implemented? How long have they been in effect for?
So I'm talking about, when I talk about sensory rooms, I'm talking about inpatient wards. So I just want to clarify that. So,
all right, which we will deal with tomorrow.
Yeah, it is more about providing a calm environment, and it is the adjustments are more clinical adjustments than structural or any procedural adjustments. So being mindful, as I said, that to undertake an assessment not in a busy, area, but move it to a calmer area, make sure that they have support of whoever is accompanying them.
And maybe the same question then, how long have those been carefully put into place or considered at the time of assessment?
There is an increasing awareness of ASD and neurodiversity in the last few years. There has been in the last few years.
By last few years, when do you mean?
However, I would assume that especially psychiatrists, they are skilled to, recognize autistic traits for autism, and would take that into consideration.
How long then has there been a wider awareness at the time of assessment?
There's definitely been more recognition post-COVID.
Okay, so since 2020, 21?
2020, yeah.
All right. Sorry. When conducting a comprehensive assessment and eliciting a comprehensive history, how do clinicians account for the effect of the mental illness itself as rendering the history potentially unreliable?
You have to take that into consideration, and psychosis is an excellent example. It's very difficult to get a history from a person who doesn't believe he's unwell, doesn't want to see you, doesn't want any treatment, and the mental illness does influence the history taking. Therefore, either you undertake subsequent assessments or you rely on significant others to obtain the information.
And finally this, and this is my fault. You told us at the very beginning of your evidence that you're a consultant psychiatrist. Do you still see patients, or is your role purely managerial at the moment?
I've got one clinical session, so I was a full-time. I had, when I was a deputy medical director till 2012, my predominant role was clinical 6 sessions. After becoming a medical director, it was reduced to a sessional input, which has initially I started working in the assessment unit, and therefore I have an understanding of assessment unit. Then I set up the RTMS service and moved my clinical role there. For a few years worked in Loughton in the outpatient clinics, and more recently, after setting up the mental health urgent care department, I've moved my clinical role there.
I said finally, but I perhaps should ask you this. In light of your last answer, how do you inform yourself of what's going on day to day on the ground at EPUT in terms of clinical practice?
So several ways. I have, I have clinical directors. Each clinical director in each locality will have a consultant meeting. The consultants will raise any issues around which they feel are relevant around quality safety to the clinical director. The clinical directors will provide a report to the medical directors meeting. So that's my way of knowing, and obviously there are structures within the organization in terms of governance where the director of governance, so that the nurse would be able to give you more information. You also have visits on the inpatient units and services where you would talk to the staff, patients, and get an idea. There are CQC compliance visits and the other regulatory visits. So I rely on my consultants and clinical directors. There are for trainees. There are again, they have several forums, Garden of Safe Working, and there are forums where they can raise any issues around patient quality or safety.
Thank you. That's all I have to ask. Chair, did you have anything else arising?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll sit again tomorrow when Dr. Corrali will be back, but this time to deal with his second witness statement when the inquiry will hear evidence about the inpatient pathway and admission onto the unit.
10 o'clock tomorrow.
10 o'clock. Thank you, Chair.